All right, welcome to mini lecture 1 for module 5. I'm going to do something a little different today. I'm going to give you 7 maps that are going to explain, in a sense, the entire region, at least in terms of some key points. Now, I will return to some of these maps in subsequent lectures, very short lectures, to kind of flesh out a little bit of this. But we're going to try to hit this fast and furious and kind of see what's going on. So here we go. First of all, pieces that we're going to hit today. The African continent remains a region that is underdeveloped for its potential, and we want to ask the question why. Well, we're going to look at the colonial legacy and the pre-colonial landscape of the African continent. Next, we're going to look at neocolonialism, what's happening in the region right now, and what does neocolonialism mean? How's it changing the region? We're going to look at Islam. We've got to understand Islam and its landscape to understand the next part, which is the conflicts in Southwest Asia, or what is often termed the Middle East. So, here we go. First map. The African continent and Southwest Asia looked really different before the Europeans really started getting into the game. If we look at this map, a couple of important ideas. These are empires. A lot of times we hear about Egypt, and so again we can think about the Nile River and its delta here, classic Egyptian culture, but that was just a small piece of the landscape. All of this region had significant and complex empires. Most notably, if you look to the west, much of sub-Saharan West Africa was dominated by complex and extremely powerful kingdoms. Most notably, you look there and you will see the Mali Empire, you will see the Songhai Empire, you will see the Hausa Empire. These are areas that controlled massive landscapes, had complex military systems and trade systems that even today influence those regions. The other thing that is worth understanding is that this landscape was transformed by this landscape. This is the Berlin Conference. Make sure you know that one from your text, Berlin Conference. What happened in the latter part of the 1800s, 1884 through 1887 in terms of the development of this, was that the European powers of the time divided up the continent of Africa before they really knew what was there. And in this, what we see today is the remains, which is a predominantly Francophone Africa in the west and a predominantly Anglophone Africa in the east. The British influence in East Africa, the French influence in West and North Africa, and those influences stay there today. And so we had pre-colonial empires, the slave trade, and then the colonial landscape that divided Africa without much thought to what was actually there. So today, we can kind of see Africa as divided in those two spheres. Now, take it one step further. Neocolonialism. Colonialism is in fact an external state controlling militarily and politically the lands of another people. Neocolonialism says we don't need the politics and we don't need the military, all we need is the economy. And so economic control or influence in an area is neocolonialism. And the reality is this map says it all about sub-Saharan Africa. This is investments by China in the countries of the region since 2010. And what you can see is that the landscape of Africa is being fundamentally transformed by Chinese investment. And that Chinese investment and Chinese aid means that China gets to influence what's happening in the region. So we often don't see that in our media, but China is changing the African continent. If you look through this map, notice what's happening. Here's Nigeria, one of the most oil-rich countries in the world, and it has some of the highest levels of Chinese investment in order to influence where and what they do with their resources. China is, in many respects, turning the African continent into its colonial landscape in terms of extraction of resources. And you can see this across the entire landscape. Now let's shift gears a little bit. The world of Islam. This is the spread of Islam up through the colonial period. And what you see here is that when we think of Islam in terms of a landscape of conflict. But in reality, Islam began as an expansive empire, a universalizing religion. Remember, that's an important term for the quiz. Universalizing religions, Christianity and Islam most notably, are those religions that believe in converting people, that all people can come to that religion. So as Islam spread, people and cultures were converted. It spread both west, all the way through Spain, and east, all the way to India and down into Southeast Asia. It's also worth noting that this heart, this core of Islam right here between Mecca and Medina, is the heart of Islam, but very quickly Islam spread into the heart of Christianity. And so that begins to be the tension. Now, Islam is a world religion. It's very clear from this map. But Islam is not one thing. This map divides the world between Sunni, at least 80% of the world's Muslims are Sunni, and Shia, that smaller part. But Shia Islam is centered right here in Iran, and Sunni Islam exists on either side of it. Okay, so that's a very, very important idea, that Sunni Islam is very, very broad, and Shia Islam is actually fairly narrow. Okay, that's an important distinction. Now, the other thing, though, that you should note is look at Saudi Arabia. You'll notice in this map that you have Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and Iran, right across this little body of water, is Shia. So a little body of water divides Shia Islam from Sunni Islam, and its two biggest players. All right. We can make that much, much smaller with the conflict of Israel and the Islamic world. And that happens because of this little tiny part of Jerusalem. This is a map of the old city of Jerusalem. And you'll notice that historically, Jerusalem was divided into different religious neighborhoods or parts of the city. So you have, for example, right here, you have the Christian quarter. And centered in the Christian quarter is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That is theoretically, or at least in terms of belief system, where Jesus was buried. Then you have, up here, we have the Muslim quarter, we have the Jewish quarter, and then we have the Armenian or Orthodox quarter. And then in none of those quarters is this area that includes the Temple Mount, okay, important to Christianity, the Western Wall, the last part of the Jewish temple, the Dome of the Rock, a sacred and one of the most sacred sites to Islam. So in one little square, the world's major religions, excluding the Eastern religions, all see sacred sites. That's a challenging issue. It's especially challenging when the United States most recently accepted the fact, or at least declared, that Jerusalem was the capital of the State of Israel. That matters to the Muslim world. Now, take it back out to conflict. In the last week, a U.S. drone was shot down somewhere over the Straits of Hormuz. Not exactly sure where, but if you look at that, the Straits of Hormuz, this little tiny narrow choke point, and is a very narrow point in terms of transportation, is the largest area, or it has the largest level of oil passing through it of anywhere in the world. The Straits of Hormuz, that little narrow choke point between Saudi Arabia and Iran, is where almost, if you really want to think about it, that strait is where the majority of the world's oil passes every day. That is a challenge, and that means that conflict between Sunni and Shia, literally across the water, is where everyone in the world pays attention to oil. All right, so those are our maps. Sunni and Shia, the Straits of Hormuz, neo-colonialism, the colonial landscape. All these things help us explain why this area is so challenging in terms of development, in terms of conflict, and in terms of our interaction. All right, we'll see you in these maps in the next several lectures.